And we talked about this. I remember, Megan, you were talking about this a little bit too. But I also learn new things because I'm reading in this context of 2020, and also I'm a different reader. Nabokov has this great quote about every reader is a rereader, that there is no reader unless you are rereading a text, and that really speaks to me as well. So rereading one particular essay in the context of 2020 has let me think about what it means to be a writer in this moment, and specifically what it means to write out of this time. So the essay is by the writer, poet, and activist Adrienne Rich, and I'll have pictures of the folks I'm talking about throughout, because that helps me to connect with folks. So I like to have visual images of the folks I'm thinking with. And so this is Adrienne Rich in this incredible library. I'm already playing that game we play on Zoom where I'm like looking at her books, and there's one of HD. I'm totally into. Okay, so anyway, she wrote this essay called The Arts of the Possible. And in it, Rich contends with what it means to be a writer during times of intensified injustice and persistent suffering. And for me, this means to be a writer really at any moment in history. So I'm going to scroll down here. Give me just a little second. We'll have these little moments of swimming together through the text, and then I'll pause. Okay. And this is where I am. This was Rich's lifelong question. What does it mean to be a human who is also a writer? Especially one who is part of a society in extreme pain. And that's her text, her language, society in extreme pain. It was a question she answered through action. In 1997, she refused the National Medal for the Arts. And in a letter about that refusal that she wrote to Jane Alexander, the then chair of the NEA. Also, I love that she copied President Clinton. Like she wrote the letter to Jane Alexander and then just like copied the president on it. She said she couldn't accept the award because the very meaning of art, as I understand it, is incompatible with the cynical politics of this administration. A president cannot meaningfully honor certain token artists while the people at large are so dishonored. And this essay, The Arts of the Possible, was written in the same year, 1997, and it really further elucidates and contends with the role of the writer in such a time of radical disparity. And in this essay, she writes about what it means to use the context and conditions of this moment to get out of the moment, move beyond. So here's the quote that is kind of the centerpiece of my talk and of my thinking right now. And here's the quote. I have from time to time, I know I'm not alone in this, felt almost unbearable forebodings, a terrifying loss of gravity, and furious grief. I have often felt doubly cut off, that I cannot effectively be heard, and that those voices I need most to hear are being cut off from me. A feeling that almost everything that has fertilized and sustained my work is in danger. I have known that this is, in fact, the very material I have to work with. It is not in spite of the times that I will write, but I will try to write in both senses out of my time. And the italics are hers. This is the quote I hold at the center of this talk today, that I will not write in spite of the times, but in both senses out of my time. I read this quote to mean that she will use the conditions and constraints of this moment to attempt to write beyond those conditions and constraints. She writes out of a time in order to get out of that time. To illustrate her point, she describes a 1973 painting by the surrealist Dorothea Tanning. She writes, the arm of the woman painter literally breaks through the canvas. We don't see the brush. What we see is the arm up to the wrist and the gash in the material. So I used to read this quote and think it meant I had to write something that would impact reality, make a difference, affect change. And that highfalutin goal was like super overwhelming to me, and I couldn't actually conceptualize how to make that happen. And what I love about Adrienne Rich is that isn't actually what she's advocating. That isn't what she's meaning. She makes clear that the point of literature isn't to create changes in reality. It isn't to change policy or political movements, but it might. So she quotes Eduardo Galeano here to make her point. To claim that literature on its own is going to change reality would be an act of madness or ignorance. It seems to me no less foolish to deny that it can aid in making this change. So rather than write with the goal to change reality, the writer is coming under the influence of reality. To write out of our time, the writer lets the impact of reality be known through a character's experience, a description of the landscape, or the use of language. By enacting how policies and politics rupture life, literature allows us to confront that experience and perhaps come to better understand and learn from it, or just get through it. So I'm thinking of Joan Didion's essays, and really any of her work. More recently, Toni Jensen's essay on the Fracklands, or Kiese Lehman's running column in Vanity Fair. You're like, Vanity Fair? What is happening? There's literature in Vanity Fair. There is literature in Vanity Fair, and it is Kiese Lehman's literature. And so he's got this running column. He's written 2 of them now. I think there are more forthcoming. But here's how he writes out of our specific time of the pandemic. And this is from his December 2020 essay, Now Here We Go Again. And so again, here's a picture of Kiese, just so you have a sense of who we're talking about, can connect with that writer. And it's a short essay in which he's thinking about this moment of the pandemic and the grief of it. After not having touched another human for over 3 months, I drove to one of the only restaurants in town that still only offers curbside service. I touched the finger of a masked woman who brought Thai fried rice with tofu level 4 to my truck. I tipped her as much as the meal costs and thanked her for committing to curbside. She put the tip in her pocket and thanked me for committing to her restaurant. There's a sentimental version of this story where, exploitation be damned, we both wait until we are out of each other's sight to clean our hands, take off our masks, and nod our heads slowly up and down at the grit, grind, and grandeur of Americans. I did not live that version of the story. The kind woman who accepted my money went directly from my truck to the car next to me. So what I want to think about as I read this work is how he's writing out of his time. And so I've tried to sort of rhetorically analyze this passage to think about that with you. So here he moves from the description of the woman delivering food to an interpretation of that moment about the sentimental version. So he's using the particular constraints of this lived moment, required hand sanitation and distance, to consider the kind of story we might tell about the moment. And through that imagining, comes to understand the kind of story we are actually living, right? So in nonfiction, there's that moment where you move from description, the particulars of experience, and into an epiphany, an interpretation of that moment, some awareness of the writing about that moment. And he does it so beautifully here and so committedly. And yet I can't get there right now. That like epiphany's beyond me, but I'll get to that in just a moment. I want to give you another example of someone who's doing this really well. Here's another example. Writing out of our time for me also includes writing from histories that continue to constrain the present. I'm thinking of Britt Bennett's recent novel, The Vanishing Half, and also Sharma Shields' The Cassandra. And here's Sharma Shields, this picture of Sharma. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So in the Cassandra, Shields is exploring the impacts of silencing women and the impact of not believing women. The novel is set in the 1940s. And the novel's protagonist is working at a nuclear facility that's developing the atomic bomb. I'll also note she did a ton of research for this novel, and it's based on Hanford, which is a nuclear research facility located like an hour from my house. This is a real place that really was working to develop the atomic bomb. And so while working there, the protagonist begins to have visions of the outcome, that this bomb will, as it did, decimate families and landscapes. And she understands that these visions, like the ones she's had all of her life, will come true. So she's someone who kind of sees her future in increments, and then it does come true. And she is beginning to see, as she works at this facility, that this bomb is going to decimate an entire population of people and landscapes. But speaking only endangers her, and no one believes her. Now, if if you're a writer and you're wanting to contend with misogyny, you might start to write into like the generalizations of that and sort of write this like big kind of summary or try to describe it. But the Cassandra does something very different. It establishes this theme from the beginning through particulars, through specifics, through dialogue and characterization. So I'm going to share with you just this excerpt from the first chapter. And the chapter is called To Make Men Free, right? Which is already directing us to like, who's going to get the benefit of the silencing that will happen. And these are the first lines from the novel. I was at the mercy of the man behind the desk. I needed him to see my future as clearly as I saw it. He held 4 pink digits aloft, ring finger belted by a fat gold band, and listed off the qualities of the ideal working woman. Chaste, willing, smart, silent. I swallowed his words, coaxed them into my bloodstream, my bones. I crossed my ankles and pinned my knees together, morphing into the exemplary she. So again, I'll do a small reading of this passage to see how it's working out of our time. So rather than describe a generalized experience of misogyny, Shields manifests that misogyny through description and dialogue. So for instance, the speaker is, quote, at the mercy of the man behind the desk from the very beginning. And that image of the man behind the desk and being at the mercy of him speaks to his power without ever saying, he was the boss, here's the boss. Right? It's that bossness is implied, that power is implied just because he's the dude behind the desk. I've got a little error here. So the way this power silences the speaker is immediate. The speaker does not name what she needs. She's keeping that quiet. She only says it to herself and through the text of the novel, which we could talk more about as a source of power later. The speaker doesn't name what she needs for this man behind the desk to see her, quote, future as clearly as she saw it. Instead, she swallows his words. Lots of implications there. Describing his ideal working woman. She ingests those, literally swallows. Chaste, willing, smart, silent, right? And if I'm swallowing something, I can't talk when I'm doing that. So just by that action of swallowing those words, I am silenced. But notice here how each word is also a descriptor and its own sentence. He doesn't say, I prefer that a woman is chaste. No, they just have one word in each sentence. And as such, for me, they feel like directives. You must be chaste. You must be willing. You must be smart, silent. So when I read the work of Kiese Lehman and Sharma Shields, I start to get a glimmer of what might be possible when writing out of this time. And yet for me, I can only aspire to it right now. I have no epiphanies these days. I can't imagine anything beyond this moment. And come to find out, I can't even fathom this moment. So before I can reflect on what is happening, as Lehman does, or transform history into dialogue and narrative as Shields does, I'm trying to return to practices of description and to pay close attention to what is happening. Now, I'm not going to be able to go anywhere until I can more fully describe where I am. So to try to write out of this time, I've tried to catch this time in 2 ways. So I'm going to share with you now a couple of practices that I've used, and then I'll stop talking and make some space for us to think together about what it means to write out of our time. So here are just 2 things I've tried in order to write out of my time in which I have not felt a lot of writing energy. So first, I started to keep what I called a boring journal, or my dull journal. And in it, I write down just what happened that day, all the little like minutia and the dull stuff. I try not to process anything, and I do not expect to make anything of the writing. And that part's been really important for me, to have no expectations around what I'm writing. The same thing happens when I free write, right? You set a timer, you just go, you don't judge, you just write as you go. So some of the things that I've written are things like, helped Elle with homework for 20 minutes. We both cried. Went for a walk and tried to get lost. Could not get lost. Made delicious pizza for dinner. We'll have it for breakfast. Or lunch, actually, just frozen pizza all the time. So this practice has kept me connected to writing, just finding words, just getting a word, putting it down. More importantly, it's helped me continue to practice modes of description, which I think is a beautiful way to start any morning of just describing an object. It helps to kind of grease the wheels of language for me in a way that can help me find words as I write. And the second thing, this is going to be a little bit longer, includes a story. So I have been trying to write with these descriptions. Sorry, I've been trying to write with disruptions. And I talked about this a little bit during our cocktail gathering. I'm trying to welcome the disruptions. And I mean the big disruptions of grief and persistent uncertainty, of inhumanity, of inequity, the disruptions in what Rich calls this society in extreme pain. But these disruptions have stayed really incomprehensible to me. They're the hardest to put words to. So I also mean that I'm trying to write with the small disruptions from family and children. So for instance, as I wrote this, my kid was asking me about playing Minecraft, like as I was writing this sentence, and I'm just trying to embed that into the work. And another small disruption, and it's small, I'm not at all complaining. I'm just wanting to mark that it was a disruption of the normal patterns that I have used to write, to go into my office on campus, to have some quiet space. But after spring break of 2020, Whitman College shut down campus and I wasn't allowed to return to my office, and it was kind of overnight. And actually, I didn't want to. I was ready to stay home and not get sick. And so I stayed home and did not get sick. But I also understood that my plants were not being watered and that they were dying. And I had kept them alive for 6 years and now I couldn't. And I just had to kind of sit with that and be with that. And then 3 months later, I had to go to my office to get some books. So I crept through campus in the middle of the night wearing a mask and snuck up the back stairwell to my office. And I unlocked the door and I was shocked to find that one leaf on one plant was still alive. And this was my Monstera deliciosa. And I trimmed the leaf from the dead plant, brought it home, let it grow new roots, and then after a couple of months was able to plant it. And so here's my picture of my plant, and they are huge. So this is a proper tree behind it. You can see the fence lines, that's 6 feet. So that gives you some gauge of how big that Monstera deliciosa is. So the original leaf was the left one, and then it grew the right one. When I shared this picture, and here's where it impacts the writing a little bit. When I shared this picture of my newly potted plant with my friend, she wrote, "That has the weight and heft of a 20-page essay." Ding! I suddenly was like, I'm going to write a 20-page essay about that. And so now I'm attempting to write this 20-page essay about the Monstera. And in writing that essay, it's also showing me a few ways that I might be writing out of my time. So I'm going to just share those with you and then I'll be done talking, I promise. Monstera, I have found some emotional distance to think about the grief and loss of this time. It has let me think about the systems that have failed to protect people. There's just something about writing about this leaf that has given me that space to do it. In researching the plant, learning about its habitat and growth pattern, or learning that it's called fenestrate, meaning the leaves get holes in them as they grow, which felt very metaphorical. I learned something new. And in learning, I do feel that I'm writing out of this time in which I feel persistent ignorance and unknowing, and not knowing what's going to happen. That active research has given me a window into knowing. And through the active research, I'm also just not actively thinking about what I can't control. So the Monstera has become a framing device for this moment and a form of ventilation, allowing me to step in and out of the difficulties in a way that is creatively catalyzing. And finally, writing about this beloved plant has pointed to the importance of taking care of myself when writing about difficult things. While I want to attend to the difficulties of this moment and write into them, I do not believe I must suffer to write. I don't owe anyone my pain or suffering. I owe myself the support needed to keep writing. I'm going to scroll up. So this approach too feels like a form of resistance for me. Taking care of myself as a writer is a way of writing out of this time, a way of breaking through the canvas of expectation, of productivity. And so I'm writing into a time in which I find protocols that are sustaining to me and the writing process, whether that's to take walks or talk to a friend or stare at a wall or returning to this essay by Adrienne Rich. So I'm going to let her end for us, because when I don't know how to end something, I read the ending to her essay where she concludes, "We are not simply entrapped in the present. We are not caged within a narrowing corridor at the end of history, nor do any of us have to windsurf on the currents of a system that depends on the betrayal of so many others. We're living through a certain part of history that needs us to live it and make it and write it." So I've said a lot, a little bit about how I'm attempting to write out of this time, but I really am interested in what you are thinking about when it comes to Rich's idea of writing out of our time and how you're doing this. So what practices sustain you? So I've got a couple questions right here, and I wonder if I would like to sit and just write for a moment, just put words to some response to these two questions, and then I'll just ask volunteers to share, and we can come into conversation and think through anything you've been wanting to talk about as I've been talking, any questions you have. So how do you respond to Adrienne Rich's idea about writing out of our time? And then also, what practices sustain you and catalyze your creativity? So we'll write together for 3 or 4 minutes, and I'll let you know when time is up, and then I'll just ask for volunteers to share. Thank you for listening to me.